planned special issue, special edition dedicated to the question of quote, why people vote the way they do, with much of the focus, if not almost all of the focus, on black-white issues between Obama and the American voter. Sunday's New York Times and Sunday's Washington Post both had lead stories titled, one was titled, "Do Polls Lie About Race?" In the case of the New York Times. The Washington Post had a lead story, issue of race creeps into campaign, and there are plenty of more to come, as we know. There's also some excellent and unfortunately not so excellent reporting going on all over the old and new media, in national and regional publications. So this is very timely, very important issue. Let me make a few brief opening observations. One of the key factors, if not the key factor, in any discussion of the role of race in U.S. elections and the way the media cover the issue has to do with what has become known as the hidden vote. The hidden vote usually referring to a certain percentage of white Americans that claim they will vote for a minority candidate running against a white candidate, but on election day, in the privacy of the voting booth, pull the lever for the white candidate, causing the minority candidate to underperform in the election relative to the polls on election day, possibly costing him or her the election. In media speak, the hidden vote is most often referred to as the Bradley effect. And the Bradley effect is referring to former Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley, an African-American Democrat who lost the 1982 California governor's race to a white Republican businessman named George Deukmejian, despite all polls showing Bradley with a solid lead going into election day, as well as in the election poll, the exit polling that day. Deukmejian ended up winning that election by about 1.2% of the vote. Other instances, often referred to as Bradley effect cases, include Charlotte, North Carolina's Mayor Harvey Gantt, who lost twice to former Senator from North Carolina Jesse Helms in the Senate race in North Carolina in both 1990 and 1996, as well as Douglas Wilder's successful run for the Virginia governorship in 1989, in which his margin of victory, less than 1%, was significantly less than the polling, which had him up around 15% leading into the election, and with a firm lead in the exit polling that day as well. So let's stipulate that race played a role in these cases. Let's also stipulate that race will certainly play some role in the upcoming election. I believe that is something about which we can all agree, and there is all sorts of credible polling, which I'm sure we'll be talking about today, showing that many voters remain reluctant to vote for a black candidate for president. So the real question is, to what effect will race play a role in the upcoming election? And let me open up a couple of points here, and I'll turn it over to the panel. Unfortunately, some media pundits are trying to turn this election into a make-or-break racial moment in American history, if not an outright referendum or last word on the role of race in America. For example, Jacob Weisberg, editor-in-chief of Slate, recently declared that if Obama should lose this election, quote, racism will be the only reason, unquote, thus proving to Jacob that America is sort of an irreparably racist country. Others would like to turn an Obama victory, assuming it matches or surpasses the polling on election day, and factors out the Bradley effect. They like to turn an Obama victory into a final word on American racism in the other direction, that Americans have finally turned the page on racism in this country, thus proving Americans are not racist. Both views are overly simplistic for a complex and historical issue like race in America, not to mention the tremendous complexities that account for the outcome of any particular election. In any event, the real effect race will play on election day will be complicated and ultimately unknowable, with due respect to the pollsters in the room. For one thing, how do you calculate the actual number of voters who may vote against Obama solely because of the color of his skin? The temptation by Jacob Weisberg and others will be to conclude that every white Democratic voter or every white independent voter, I factor out the Republicans because let's assume they're going to vote Republican anyway, that every white Democratic voter and every white independent voter who breaks for McCain on election day did so due to the color of Obama's skin. But this would be an absurd conclusion. We saw that very same phenomenon in 1980, 1984, 1988, 2000, and 2004. It can't be that when Democrats vote for white Republicans over a white Democrat, they're called Reagan Democrats, But if they vote for a white Republican over a black Democrat, they become racist Democrats. You know, it can't be that simple. This is not to dismiss the role of race in America or the role of racism in the upcoming election. Both still exist and will matter. But it is to urge caution against making oversimplified conclusions. In addition, it is equally plausible that a reverse Bradley effect may occur in this election. What Marty Peretz of the New Republic calls the Bradley effect. He refers to the Bradley effect as he says that all of the chatter about the Bradley effect, like what we're doing right now, for example, and all the talk of America still being too racist to elect a black candidate will lead some Americans, including working class Americans, to go out of their way to prove the racism charge to be false and to vote for Obama even though he may not have been their first choice. And of course, white voters who vote against Obama simply for his skin color need to be offset with newly registered voters who are voting simply to vote for an historic black candidate. Finally, though race will surely play a role in the minds of some voters on Election Day, overemphasizing the role of race to a stark degree is to diminish other legitimate reasons voters may turn against a candidate, even one they may have been strongly leaning toward. Take John Kerry, please. Take John Kerry as an example. On Election Day 2004, John Kerry not only seriously underperformed relative to the national polls leading up to the election, which had him roughly even with Bush, he especially underperformed regarding the exit polling on Election Day in key states like North Carolina, where his running mate John Edwards is from, Ohio, Florida, all of which had Kerry leading very big before the actual in the exit polling before the actual returns start to come in, leading so big that Bob Shrum drafted Kerry his victory speech for that night before the actual results start to come in. I dare say that if Kerry were black, we'd be talking today about the Kerry effect as a symbol of racism in America. The fact is, undecided voters broke big time for Bush on Election Day 2004, and many were apparently unwilling to admit that to exit pollsters, which obviously had nothing to do with the color of John Kerry's skin and everything to do with other intangible and tangible issues voters have rattling around their heads when they enter the voting booth on Election Day. Ironically, Obama may be more hurt on Election Day by the same intangible that hurt Kerry than by his race. And that is a notion, fairly or unfairly, of Obama being a member of the out-of-touch elite, which is partly why Palin was chosen to run as his running mate. Obama may have been more hurt by his unguarded comment at a San Francisco fundraiser last spring about bitter small-town rural Americans clinging to guns and religion than his race. In any event, those are all things that are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to poll. Before I turn it over to the panel, let me at least mention that race is only but one issue of identity politics in this year's election. There have also been important discussions of gender, particularly in the Democratic primary. Many Hillary Clinton supporters say that sexism and gender bias in society and the media cost Hillary Clinton the nomination. There are also important ethnic issues, especially the role of the Latino vote in the election. How do Latinos feel about a black candidate, the role of immigration policy, issues in the minds of Latino voters, and other things that Rudy might touch upon. And let's not forget about an often neglected, powerful voting bloc, elderly voters. Almost all polls show that elderly voters remain the most likely group to admit that they will not vote for a black candidate. The problem for the Obama campaign is that elderly voters vote in far greater numbers than other demographics. And lately, the Obama campaign has been engaging in a not-so-subtle age-type campaign where their talking points is that McCain is erratic. He's out of control. Their description of it after the debates was that he was meandering and wandering off the question. You know, all these things are kind of code ageist kind of words. So you don't want to, tick off the older voters too much because they come out in droves and they vote. We don't want to look back and say that the geezer effect, for lack of a better word, cost Obama the election. But let me. Those are some opening remarks. Let me turn it over to the panel. If you want to decide who goes first,
I'll go first. So I'm going to jump in line in front of the line. There's been a great deal of ink spilled on the idea that there's some degree of number of white voters out there who refuse to vote for a black candidate. And so we've heard comments about the Bradley effect. We heard Hillary Clinton's comments about whether hard-working white Americans are going to vote for a black candidate. But basically, there's been very little reporting, very little discussion about the role of Obama's campaign within the black community. How has it altered in any way their political attitudes, their political viewpoints? So first, I want to begin with a critique of an article that appeared over a year ago in the New York Times and sort of talk about how I think the press has really missed an opportunity to report on the internal political dynamics that are happening within the black community regarding Obama's candidacy. So I want to start this conversation with a New York Times article that was titled, So Far, Obama Can't Take Black Voters for Granted, which appeared on February 2nd, 2007. Now, as a citizen and as a political scientist, I assumed that this article was going to be about why Senator Clinton was polling better among black voters than Senator Obama. I was looking for sort of some discussion about black loyalty to the Democratic Party and how that loyalty was transferred to Senator Clinton because of the popularity of Bill Clinton, or that the reason why Senator Clinton is doing so well among black voters because she's raised more money, or black voters who are loyal Democrats want an electable candidate. But instead, this whole article became a conversation about whether Barack Obama was black enough. And what's interesting about this is that the article stated that black voters were uneasy about Senator Obama because of the sense that there existed the sense that he wasn't black enough. Now, rather than sort of report a survey of black political attitudes that would explore questions of racial group identity among blacks and political beliefs, the Times took a different route. What they did is that the story quoted a black journalist, Stanley Crouch, a black writer, Deborah Dickerson, and a guy cutting hair at a barbershop. There were two political scientists that were asked to comment on the story, but the statements that they made did not include any information about trends in black voting behavior or black public opinion. What we got as evidence that sort of Obama was having problems in the black community is, here's a quote from Stanley Crouch. Quote, "When black Americans refer to Obama as one of us, I do not know what they're talking about," unquote. Deborah Dickerson. "I've got nothing but love for the brother," she says, "but we don't have anything in common. His father was African, his mother was a white woman. He grew up with white grandparents," unquote. The barber. Quote, "We've been taught that a president should come from right here, born, raised, bred in America. To go outside and bring someone in from another nationality, now that doesn't feel right to some people." So this is the New York Times analysis of why black voters were split between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And in many ways, I find it very insulting because when we see sort of reporters delving into sort of trends in the mainstream population, or even estimating the Bradley effect, there's some hard empirical evidence to back up their claims. Now, after Obama's victory in Iowa, the media started reporting on race in the campaign. It went from one episode to another, with some stories reporting legitimate questions while others were trivial. Stories on the so-called Bradley effect that explore whether white voters are concealing their true feelings of voting for a black candidate has been explored throughout. Then there's the question of Reverend Wright. And so these questions, or these stories, in my view, were very legitimate. But then there were these, I would say, trivial stories about whether the nation's progress on civil rights was more attributed to President Johnson or Martin Luther King, which was the case of stories that developed during the South Carolina primary. And then Bill Clinton's comments about Barack Obama, whether his opposition to the war was fantasy, was misconstrued as saying his campaign was a fantasy, and he was in many ways painted as being racially insensitive. And more recently, John McCain's pointing at Barack Obama saying, in the last debate, saying that one, people describe as sort of being a racially insensitive comment. Again, these things, in my view, border on the trivia compared to what I think are much more pressing issues and stories that could be discussed. Now, what I want to do is present some interesting data from Columbia Center on African American Politics and Society in collaboration with ABC News. It really sort of talk about what I think some interesting findings among the black population. I mean, I think many of us think that just because that there's a viable black candidate, that black people would march lockstep with that candidate. And so I think in many ways that's why there have been very few stories, with the exception of the interesting piece by Matt Bai in the New York Times Magazine called The End of Black Politics. I think was it Matt Bai?
Yeah, Matt Bai.
Yeah, he's trying to put me out of business, but nonetheless, I think it was a very interesting story about the internal dynamics, political dynamics that are happening within the black community. What I think what we've missed is that black people have been considerably energized in this campaign at greater rates than the general population. This survey was taken in September, mid-September of this year, and a question was asked about black participation in the last 12 months on various measures of civic and political engagement. Questions about had they worked for a political candidate or party within the past 12 months, or tried to sway others to vote, and also contributed to a campaign. And as you will see, nearly a third, almost a third of African Americans reported in this survey that they had contributed to a political campaign, 10 points greater than the rate of whites in the population. And we see Latinos giving at a less level. But also we see the rate double among blacks for those who have been involved in a political campaign, double the rate. What is this all about? Why is it that we see these greater levels of civic engagement, political engagement? And why aren't journalists talking about this? Are they assuming just because that this is a black candidate who's been doing well, that we see greater levels of civic participation, particularly in a time where Americans have been criticized for being less civically engaged? If you're familiar with Robert Putnam's book on Bowling Alone. And then we also see at sort of similar rates African Americans and whites talking about the political campaign and trying to persuade others to participate. Another interesting thing is the surge, I believe, in national pride among African Americans, which I think is not trivial, given that African Americans have historically felt a sense of second-class citizenship in the United States. Just several years ago, when during the Katrina disaster, where African Americans felt that the federal government abandoned black people in New Orleans. We see that African Americans feel that they're more proud to be an American. This is sort of a Michelle Obama question, right? That his elections made them feel more proud, considerably more than you see for whites and for Hispanics, who are more likely to say that the election had no effect, or his nomination rather had no effect on their feelings of pride. Now, what I did is sort of looked at this question across time. The question wasn't asked exactly the same way. But here's a question posed to African Americans. Do you see yourself American first, or do you see yourself black first? This is sort of challenging this dual identity, what W.E.B. Du Bois described as this double consciousness in the souls of black folks. And potentially we see a surge in a feel of Americanness among African Americans. Again, I think that's something that's been missed in this whole reporting about race and the elections. And the question was asked differently, so that may account for some of the differences. But I suspect that there is some effect from the Obama campaign. 76%, 3/4, basically in 1995 and 2000 felt themselves to be more black than American. And here we have a divide in the black community. By 2008, roughly half of black Americans see themselves as American first, and the other half black first. Again, I think this is perhaps a sea change in the political attitudes of African Americans that hasn't been captured, I think, when we think about what impact the Obama campaign has had on black communities. And thinking about competing identities, national versus racial identities, we found something that I totally did not expect. The sense that across the board, Hispanics, whites, and blacks feel that they have more in common with their social class, whether that's middle class or working class or upper class, than they do with their racial group. If you were to read the newspapers, right, you would not think that there was this sense of class identity and connectedness that exists there, given that the emphasis on, you know, white voters, white working class voters, African Americans, Latinos. So here again, I think that the way that reporters and actually I think political analysts in general have thought about race and elections, I think we have to do some rethinking about some things. About in this moment where, and I haven't conceded this yet, where there's a sense that we live in a post-racial America. That's the part I haven't conceded. That actually there may be some competing identities that are out there that are very important in building coalitions, which I think is happening now with the Obama campaign, that's being overlooked. Because we often think of, when we think of voting and elections, we think in terms of specific constituencies. Whites, blacks, white working class, Southerners. So my plea is that reporters begin to delve much more deeper when we think of the role of the election, race, and black political attitudes.
Okay.
Thanks, Fred. Let's turn it over to Rudy.
Yeah, can we go to how did we get there?
Yeah.
Go down at the bottom. Right there. Okay, I'm going to take a bit of a different tack, but I'm going to end up in the same place. And I'm really going to, part of what I'm going to say, I need to preface with the difference that this may be one of those cases where science, social science, is less useful than a sense of the world. I love to tell my colleagues often that even if the facts are wrong, the story's true. And I think I'm going to argue that some of the facts that I could draw on will contradict what is said, but I think the story is true. And I want to begin on blacks, move to Latinos. Okay? And I would begin the following way. It is absolutely the case that this election will not end racism if Obama loses. Or will not bring to life racism if Obama loses. Or that it will kill it if he wins. But I do think that I believe within the black community, given all that's happening, if Obama loses, I fear you will alienate a generation of blacks, at least one generation. They will have been socialized into this world when they had a candidate who by every measure was better than the other guy. Now, at that moment, you've got to give me all the complexities as to, well, they didn't really vote on race. And the black kid, 19, 20 years, is going to say, oh, that's a bunch of crap. And you're going to lose a generation of blacks. The older ones are not going to lose because they're already angry with you, and they're just going to be validated. The young ones, I fear you will lose, maybe for their political life. Now, illustrative of that, and I've thought about this a lot. I've modified my positions over time. I keep finding it interesting, and I think it's been said a few times, that we call Obama a black candidate. He's half white. Why don't we call him a white candidate? We can't call him a white candidate in the American lexicon because he's got some black. Now you recall it wasn't too long ago where if you were 1/16 black in Mississippi, you were a black man. It doesn't matter what you look like, you were a black man. Well, here we've got a guy who you could say, there's two white guys running for office. One is educated and one sat in prison, and that made him a hero. Okay. Two white guys. Why don't we say it? Because we can't configure race that way. And until we can configure race that way, I think we have a lot of evidence, and I want to use the phrase that blacks are lockstep. You know, when 90% of blacks in every poll say they're going to vote for Obama, I call that lockstep. That's 90% of blacks are saying they're going to vote for Obama. So I'll give you 10% who don't want to be black, 10% including crazies, whatever you want. But 90%, you know what that means? 90%? Now, if that's not being in lockstep, what does it mean? Now, it does get more complicated for blacks, and I really like the data. Here's where I'm going to start to move to Latinos, where blacks identify across class lines. Now, that's really interesting, except the contamination effect. Most blacks are of the same class. So I'm not sure how much of a boundary they've crossed to say, I'm working class. How many rich blacks do you know? I don't know any rich blacks. Every black I know is screwed to the wall. So I'm working class, but how much does that distinguish my being black from being, for whites it makes a difference. Does it make a difference for blacks? Now let me add here and start moving to Latinos, where I'm going to go. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. Now, I was on a PBS show last week, and I got hate mail for the things I said about the Latino vote, including that most people, the Cubans, don't like to call themselves Latinos because they're superior to Latinos. They're Cuban. Latinos are uneducated, illegal, working class. We, the Cubans, are upper class, educated, white. You know when I'm a Latino as a Cuban? I said when I can make some money out of it. I got hate mail around that from, really ugly stuff. Okay? Now, Latinos, there's part of that new mythology about Latinos. And I was going to suggest that I feel kind of like somebody called and said, hey Rudy, there's a Halloween party, come dressed as uglily as you can. But what they really had was a ball of elegance, only I'm the guy that came dressed as ugly as I could. Right? Everything said, let's assume it's correct. You really don't have to talk about Latinos in this election. But there's a machine out there that talks about how important the Latino vote is. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't tell me how important the Latino vote is and then focus exclusively on blacks. Or, when you bring in Latinos, you ask the same question. Will Latinos vote for a black? It's still a black focus. So, in a very real way, other than the immigration issue, which nobody's talking about, Latinos are not on the map. Now I want to go through and show you that a bit. These are, as of September, the competitive states. Colorado, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia. Three of them, and these have fallen over. Pennsylvania is now blue. Ohio is becoming blue. Virginia is, I think, becoming light blue. Florida is becoming blue. So Colorado is moving toward blue. Latinos aren't very important in any of these except maybe Florida. And in Florida, they're dividing against the Cubans. You may know Cubans are no longer the majority Latino population. They're a plurality. And Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and others are now outnumbering the Cubans. That's important given the role the Cubans play. All right? How do I change this?
We're not told to view. You can go here. Just click on here.
Click on,
This box right there.
no,
Yeah. And then you can.
that's the previous one. Yeah, that's me. Okay.
Sorry.
So what do I do? Now I can do this? Okay, now in 2004, the states with margins less than 4% were these. You might call those competitive. Of those, one had a large Latino population, New Mexico. I lost money guaranteeing my friend that the Mexicans were going to vote Democratic in New Mexico. That Bill Richardson could carry them, and he couldn't. He didn't. But the rest, notice the Latinos were not present in any of the so-called competitive states. As of 1014, these are the competitive states. And it's not clear that in any of these, the Anglo vote, the white non-Hispanic vote, is going to be so divided that the small number of Latinos there will influence the election. Chances are they won't. I mean, you need whites to just divide almost perfectly. If they tilt a little bit, the Latino vote will not matter. Okay? These figures are kind of interesting because, among other things, it means Obama's winning without Latino votes. Now, the first number is wrong. I think it's backwards, but I've got to check that. What this shows you is that the Latino eligible voter population is much bigger than the percent who vote. Without staying there, just pick any state and you can see it. That the percentage drops quite a bit from eligible to actually likely voters.
Like 22.6, probably. 22.6.
No, Arizona should be 17 eligible, 12 voting. Okay, the rest are pretty okay. Now, if you look at the citizens going from 1980 to 2004, and you can look at either panel, what you see is this tremendous growth in the Latino population. Nobody can deny that. Latinos go from 53 to 58% of the registered voters. They go from 44 to 47% of the voters. But at every point, they vote less than blacks and much less than whites. At every point. Now we can talk about why that is, but one of the most important things that affects how you vote is your age. Latinos are young. Young people don't vote. The outreach that Obama has, it's not obvious that it's hitting the high-density Latino area. So we probably are going to see, I mean, take a look across the top. 19% of Latino adults, or 33% turnout rate among the young group compared to 47% for whites and blacks. That's 14 points. That's huge in an election. Latinos, and you can do it for education and others. I've got to hurry, 5 minutes, okay. Their vote in states goes up continuously, nonetheless. The percent of citizens goes up so that in 2004, there were 47% of all of the citizens voting and registered voting, as opposed to 65% of whites. What those charts together tell you is that even though the Latino population is growing in absolute numbers, they're not closing the gap in turnout. It's going like this. It's not narrowing that gap to a significant degree. In 2008, we expect to have 11 million Latino registered voters and 9 million turning out. Those are high estimates. Okay? Now, will Latinos vote for Obama? This is the first way to really link this. In the primaries, Latinos did not vote for Obama. Is that because they're racist? Well, some are racist. They're American, so that's part of the reason they're racist, but they also come with some racism and socialize with the old racism. But how about partisanship? Latinos are overwhelmingly Democratic, or they're independent voting, leaning Democratic. An independent leaning Democratic is more likely to vote Democratic than a weak Democrat. So Latino Democrats are going to vote for Obama. The issue is going to be class. Working class people, despite what Stuart would have you believe, tend to vote in a certain direction. Whites get weird on this, but even they. Latinos are going to vote, I have bet, I think they'll hit 75% Obama because of partisanship and class. Will they turn out? That's a very different question. Of those who vote, 75%, 70 is a good number, 70 is a lot. Of those who, but how many are going to vote? That we do not know. There is no established outreach into the Latino virus. It's just not there. That's not what Obama grew up with. That's not what he knows. And it's not natural black outreach. It's easy for Obama to do that. It's not easy for Obama to reach that. Okay. The issues, and with this I'll close. What are the issues Latinos care about? Like, Latinos are very class-oriented, more so than ethnic-oriented. What do they care about? The number one issue, every time we talk to them, is education. The economy, they want jobs. They want health access. They're not pro-immigration. They're anti-discrimination against immigrants. And why? Because they could be harassed just like the guy who got here yesterday. The three issues that Obama is pushing, the economy, health, and education, are their issues. Obama doesn't lose anything by not raising education, by not raising immigration. With that, let me stop. And then we can
Thanks, Rudy. Let me ask everyone in the room to not send Rudy any hate mail. And I will take the bet on 75% over-under
Okay.
after the...
All right.
Let me turn... keep in mind your questions, because we will have time to address questions specifically to people. On that, let me turn over to... You have plenty of time to do...
Sure, and I'm going to just do this fairly quickly so we can actually get in a conversation about all this, because obviously it's top of mind with most people. All y'all that are sitting out by the corner, you can come you're welcome to like come sit by us if you don't want to like stand for the next 45 minutes and sit outside the door. This isn't like church where you have to leave early and get out there. If you can come sit over here, we're welcome to come sit down here. A couple of things. First, I mean, you know, in every election, you have to deal with, in a campaign as a candidate, people's perceptions of you that are cued by characteristics. How you look, how you talk, your mannerisms. Because the public is looking for not only just the words that come out of your mouth, but a sense of what it tells them about you in how you conduct yourself. So we can all have a ivory tower discussion about, well, isn't it unfortunate that we're not having a policy debate or whatever? But race will enter in, sex will enter in, age will enter in, weight will enter in. We talk about racism. There's racism, there's sexism, there's ageism, there's faithism, I call it, still in this country. Whether or not somebody's faith that they hold is felt as part of the mainstream. And there's many other factors that people come with prejudices on when they walk in and decide how to vote. I don't think this election, if Barack Obama loses, it won't be because he's black. If he had lost the primary, and I had said this in a column I wrote during the primary, it wasn't going to be because he was black that he would have lost. When Hillary Clinton lost, she did not lose because she was a female. Mitt Romney didn't lose because he was a Mormon. There are many other things that go into this. I have an argument over all day long about Hillary Clinton and why she lost. The dominant factor in that, you could have a debate over whether she had the right strategy, what she did right, Bill Clinton's role, all those sorts of things. And Barack Obama was not going to lose the race, in my view, in the primary, and won't in the general election, based upon his race. And I think the media, which I think does a disservice, when they refer to the Tom Bradley effect, that happened 26 years ago. 26 years ago. And the country is in a much different place, and how we conduct our politics is in a much different place, for a variety of reasons. Even if you go back and use the Tom Bradley effect, it was way overused, even in the course of that race. And from what I can recall and research, is they took one poll that was done before Election Day, where I think Tom Bradley was up 8 or 10 points, and then the race became a dead even race on Election Day. And by the basis of that poll and what happened on Election Day, everybody said, well, what happened? It was a hidden vote. He lost. Well, the interesting thing is when you go back and look at the internal polls of both campaigns, the internal polls of both campaigns had the race within 2 or 3 points. And so many times we sit here and we refer to public polls and what happened in a public poll and what's going on, or an exit poll, and then we interpret from bad data a cause and effect that may not exist. Now, was there some race involved in the Tom Bradley? Sure. Was there some race involved in the Harvey Gantt race? Sure. But if you take a look at the last 4 or 5 African-American candidates to run statewide in 2006, every one of which at the ballot box got the same exact number they polled going into Election Day. Every single one. Going into Election Day they got. And so when we look at this election, in my view, if Barack Obama retains the lead that he has today, which absent some huge gaffe or problem within the course, I think it has to happen within the next 48 hours or 72 hours, he will, or an external event that happens. If he goes into Election Day up 5 or 6 points, he will win nationally by 4, 5, or 6 or 7 points. Because some polls vary and the data varies. Interesting, I overheard the Kerry thing. John Kerry and the Bush, involved in the Bush campaign, the numbers on Election Day came back exactly the way we thought they would. And Bush called me up on Election Day morning and said, what's going to happen? I think we're going to win by 5 or 6. And I said, well, that's not going to happen. You're going to win by 2, maybe 3 points. You're going to win by 2.5 points. Ohio, the last poll we had us up 1.5 points in Ohio. The last poll in Florida had us up 5 in Florida. And so much of the sort of people's sort of expectation is conditioned by a lot of public polling out there, much of which is not accurate. Much of which is done badly, done poorly, and then what happens is, well, wait a sec, there was a public poll out there that showed X, Y, and Z. Something happened. What happened? Oh, it was some hidden vote, or it was the gay marriage stuff on the ballot in Ohio, or it was something, and we interpret it, when in reality, the data, in most cases, comes back the exact same way. And so, my expectation is there won't be any race effect in this election, on election day. Any race effect in this election. And not the least of which is we're in also a different place. When you're a candidate for a president, and the capacity for people to gather information and to figure it out along the way and then decide how they're going to vote is much greater than it is for a U.S. Senate race or a governor's race. And so if there has been race involved in somebody's interpretation of a candidate and where they're going to vote, most of it is now, it's already telling itself in the polls. And so if somebody was going to vote for John McCain and against Barack Obama at this point in time, and race was an important factor, it's not as if they're sitting there and saying, I don't want to say, I'm not going to say. They're going to use some other rationale that they've already come up with that they're going to say the reason why they're voting for John McCain. And so, for me, this election day will not have a hidden anti-Obama vote based upon racial factors. The undecided vote in this race will break according to, first, the ratio of favorability among the two candidates among the undecided votes. If you can look at the ratio, if you can take a look at the undecided vote, 6% of the undecided vote, and find out what their view of the two candidates are, and if it's roughly even, then the undecided vote will split. If one candidate has a dominant favorable advantage, then that candidate will get the lead. It won't be, and then looking at the demographics of the undecided vote, if a percentage of the undecided vote is black, in likelihood those black voters will go in the same percentage as what happens on election day. Hispanics, the same way. Whites, the same way. The undecided votes breaks along the lines of their view of the candidates and the demographics they represent, just like it does on election day. And that's, I think, a misinterpretation, I think, that people have on this race. On lockstep, I was mentioned lockstep voting for Barack Obama. Barack Obama is getting, whatever the number is, 91, 90%, 89% of the African American in this country. He's not getting those votes because he's African American. He's getting those votes because he has a D by his name. And George Bush got 8% of the African American vote, and John Kerry got 90%, I think, of the African American vote in 2004. And so, whether it's because there's a dominant working class, whether or not African Americans in this country have adapted the Democratic Party as their own and don't feel like the Republican Party represents their interest. And keep in mind, it wasn't that long ago in the history of time that black African Americans voted overwhelmingly for Republicans in this country. Pre-1960, if you look at the data on this, African Americans voted a majority for even in 1960, I think they basically split their vote, or the vote was not far apart in 1960. And so, it's interesting to me that Rudy, I'm not to point this out, but if Hispanics vote 75% for Barack Obama, are they voting in lockstep for Barack Obama because he's African American, or because he's a Democrat and he's not the Bush administration, and doesn't represent the views, they're representing their interests? And so I think that one bigger question that I have, I think it is significant. It will be significant when Barack Obama, I shouldn't say when, I shouldn't say that. If he wins this election, which it looks like he will, I think it will significantly change over time how Americans look at race and politics in this country. And John F. Kennedy, being Irish Catholic, when he won the election, it didn't instantaneously change how people viewed Catholics in this country and how people view Irish people in this country. But it was the beginning signs of a look at ourselves and deciding that we were not like what our grandparents were, what our parents might have been, what our great-grandparents were. And I think it will change fundamentally how we look at ourselves as a country and how the world looks at us. On one day, it will fundamentally change how the world looks at us because I don't know if you've seen polls and all across the world, is I think it will come as a bigger surprise to people in Europe that the United States just elected an African-American president, which, keep in mind, they've never done. I mean, we all talk about the regressive nature of the Europe and all that kind of stuff. They have never elected, I think, a non-white in any European country. They've elected women, but not a non-white candidate in European country, and it will fundamentally change. I think it will change. I think it will cause, in my view, Latinos, it will change the way Latinos see, because it's going to be like, oh my God, we're going to wake up on election, which I think we're actually going to know on election night. This is not going to be one of these deals where we have to like wait another 2 days or 3 days to figure out what the election results were. I think it's going to be over by the time everybody goes to bed in this room, especially when North Carolina is too close to call for like 3 hours. And as soon as that happens, go to bed, because Obama just won. Which is what's going to happen, I think. I think we're going to sit there, it's going to be 3 or 4 hours, and they're going to finally color it red. But I think it'll be long before that. And so I think it took the right kind of candidate. I think in many times in politics, the environment opens up and the right candidate walks through it in the right way at the right time in a sense of what we need in this. I think we are at that moment. I think it had to be the right, and I don't say this pejoratively, it had to be a candidate that could appeal to white voters in this country. Jesse Jackson broke ground. Many other people broke ground. Just like I think Jackie Robinson, honestly, it required somebody that could balance that, that could both simultaneously appeal to the African American community and also have a strong enough voice that he could speak to the Latino community, he could speak to the white community. And I think one of those kind of people comes around only so often. I think Barack Obama is that kind of person that came around. And so I think
I'm Barack Obama and I approve this
message. And this is from the former Bush strategist. I do think it's a great, hopeful sign that we are. But I do think we have this conversation, we're having this panel, and we have all these discussion in the media. I think we're going to wake up on election night or on election morning, and race was no factor in the election returns that come back on election day.
Can I ask a very simple question?
Yeah.
What white candidate has gotten 91% of the black vote?
John Kerry.
He got 91%? No. He hit that high?
Yeah.
Every Democrat runs for president.
Absolutely. Since Lyndon Johnson was before. Let me also ask a quick question. I know Fred
Dukakis hit 88.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Kerry hit 91.
Yeah.
Bush got 8% of
I'll
the.
take that.
I know Fred has it's limited time. Let me ask Matt one quick question because it was a lot of this Obama stuff. The time is now. He's the one, etc.
No, I didn't say that.
It's on tape.
I have criticized Barack Obama. I think there are certain things about it. I think Barack Obama, up until the last 60 days, I think the problem that he had wasn't a race thing, which was an inability to speak to the working class of this country, which is why I think he had a problem with Latinos, which is why I think he had a problem with voters in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He did not speak to their fears and anxieties. I think he has learned that. I think he's done a much better job in the last 60, 90 days, but that was something that he did. Keep in mind, he got beat among all those folks throughout the primaries, and now he's ahead among all those folks today. It's a candidate that has learned along the way that he was not doing well in that.
Absolutely. I actually have a fairly serious, pretty quick question, which is, you mentioned Jesse Jackson breaking some ground. What about your theory of Colin Powell if he decided to run? I mean, he seemed to me that he really could have been the first black candidate that could have won possibly in the '96 election. Do you think so?
I always thought, it's interesting. I always thought, one of the things I had thought was that the first woman or the first African American was going to be a Republican.
Right.
I'd always thought that because the gain you make of that in the electorate, the problem is you got to get through the primary, the Republican primary, which is a difficult thing. The gains that you make in the electorate, being a woman Republican or an African American Republican, are so much bigger than you are when you're that as a Democrat, because you already have a certain percentage of the vote. I don't think Colin Powell it's interesting. If Colin Powell was the Republican running in this race, he wouldn't be getting 91% of the African American vote. He might be getting 18%. He might double what George Bush had. Might. I don't even know. But I thought, the problem is that you can't win unless you what's the right, I was going to use a pejorative expression.
Go ahead.
Sack up. You got to sack up to get in this race. It's something you ought to give Barack Obama credit for, but Colin Powell never put his name on the line and never was willing to do that. I don't think he would have gotten overwhelmed, but I do think he would have had some across appeal, mainly to moderate voters. Mainly to moderate voters.
What about Condoleezza Rice?
Well, I always thought Condoleezza Rice, the problem was now she's an advocate of a failed war policy that...
But besides that.
That was the rest of the play, Mrs. Lincoln. Besides that. I don't, earlier on I thought she would have been a very appealable candidate. I think she could have been actually a candidate that could have won the Republican nomination. I think she could have won the Republican nomination if she was willing to put her name on the line. Again, she didn't put her name on the line, was unwilling to do that. I think she got so tied to Bush, it would have made it much more difficult to run an election like this, where the best thing you can do as a Republican is run away from Bush. It would have made it very hard in this election cycle to do that. I do still think that an emergence of a woman Republican, and I know this is about race, but the opportunities, I think, for a Republican, either a black, a Latino, or a woman, makes it easier in a general election when you have that brand than it does, I think, for a Democrat.
Quick question. You say there's no race effect that's going to occur in this. What about?
I don't think. I don't think.
But what about the reverse? I mean, because you went on about what a great moment this is. I mean, don't you believe there are a lot of people that are voting for Obama for those exact reasons?
I think they're
voting. As I said
at the beginning of this, I think that people take their cues. People want change, and they want something new, and they're tired of the status quo, and the status quo is a disaster, and that's what people think. And so I think Barack Obama's candidacy, through a combination of things, his race, his youth, how he speaks, who he is, conveys that he's new and different. It tells people, it's a quick signal to say, you don't want the same, you don't want the status quo, and you don't want what's gone on before. This thing looks different. This guy looks different, and he's young, and he's new, and he's black. He's probably going to be different. And it's not, I don't think, a race-based thing. It's just part of a factor that people say, yeah, he's saying he's going to bring change, and he looks the part that he'd bring change. He's probably going to bring change.
But aren't Americans actually wary of change? I mean, American voters they flirt with change, but when they go into the election booth, regardless of the race of the candidate, I mean, they sometimes get these cautious status quo, devils on their shoulder that say, let's go with the known difficult.
I think it's the dynamics of it. I
mean, Howard Dean
they're leery of it. They're leery of it if the candidate hasn't crossed the threshold and people can't see them in the Oval Office. I think Barack Obama, which is why I thought the first debate sort of changed the dynamics of this and solidified this. The average American saw both of them, and they might disagree with Barack Obama policies, but they saw two candidates that they could both see in the Oval Office. And if you're a change candidate that somebody sees you as qualified and has the ability and is ready to lead and can sit in the Oval Office, then they're going to be willing to take a chance. The problem is, if Sarah Palin was on the top of the ticket, then they'd have a problem, which is because the majority of the country does not see her as ready and qualified to assume that chair. And so they're not going to go for crazy change. They're going to go for change that they sort of have some confidence that.
You and Rudy should get together. But another good example, Reagan had that exact same thing happen.
Reagan had a debate, which is why I told people.
Reagan was a change candidate that people were
that
very
race was dead
distrustful
even. The race in 1980 was dead even. They have their first debate 9 days before Election Day. That I think October 28th or whatever, 27th it was, because they had all this dispute beforehand because of John Anderson. They didn't have a debate until 8 or 9 days before Election Day. As soon as Ronald Reagan showed up in the debate and people say, I can see that guy as president, he's not scary, I don't have to be afraid, he seems to know what he's doing, every single poll broke within 48 hours of that debate, because it's not something he said, but he basically proved to people that he could sit in the Oval Office, they could trust him, and he wasn't some crazy guy.
Yeah, they were comfortable with the change candidate. Okay, let's, if there are any direct questions?
One last thing. It's again, is the story right even if the facts are wrong? if what you said is true, I cannot explain the following Latino elections, which should translate into black elections. Henry C. Sneddons wins the mayoralty in San Antonio. I'm going to caricature it. Every Mexican who could move voted. Ken Salazar wins in Colorado, a candidate like Obama. Ken Salazar wins in Colorado, never talks about ethnicity. And every Mexican who could walk voted. Villaraigosa in LA, the first time runs a confused campaign, the second time says, I'm not running for mayor of Mexicans, I'm running for mayor of LA. And every damn Mexican who could walk voted. Now, if ethnicity / race has no effect, I've got to figure out why, and maybe it's a turnout rate rather than a percentage rate.
No, I didn't say it had no effect. I said there
Well,
would be
you
no.
did say, he said race had no effect.
No, I said.
Didn't he say race
Wait a
had
second. I said
race had no? Miss Taylor, would you tell us the
Wait a
truth?
second. What I said was, well, there will be no hidden race effect.
No, you said no race effect.
No, there will be no hidden race effect on election day.
What does hidden mean?
Hidden means what we see is what the Americans are how they're gonna vote. Is there racism in this country? Absolutely. Is there people that are not voting for Barack Obama today and have said they're voting for John McCain? Are there some people that are doing that because he is African American? Yes. But what I was trying to say is all of that in today's world is all factored in to where people are and where they are today. So what I said was, if he's ahead by 5 points on election day, he will win by 4, 5, or 6 points on election day.
Let me interject here. Have you seen the numbers for Harold Ford Jr.'s race in D.C.? Because it seems like the polls were pretty much on point.
The polls were dead accurate.
Although there was the injection of race with the Playboy Bunny calling Harold commercial.
He was one of the 5 races, one of the 4 or 5 races.
But it was pretty much on point.
No, there was not this Bradley effect.
Was it 3 percentage points?
Yeah, it was 3 percentage points.
Right. Yeah, it's almost exactly. Yeah. Even Harold
And
Ford,
that's in Tennessee.
Harold Ford comments on it all the time. Even he.
You know, the interaction, I hear no interaction effect, and I know you don't mean that. Blacks voted at 91% for Kerry. When you walk around New York, do you not sense an enthusiasm among blacks for Obama that you didn't sense with Kerry?
No, but
you don't sense that?
Well, but no, not with Kerry. But what about?
No,
what about Clinton?
But even with Clinton, at that same level of intensity, and there's an interaction effect. You know,
I don't disagree with that. Do I think that just like an Irish Catholic running for president, that causes people to feel like they actually have a part in this, and that they feel part of America, and that they feel like that there is something, and I'm going to motivate. I may be more motivated before. I think that happens. I absolutely think that happens, and I think that is true for Barack Obama. But I also think that he's getting some of that among younger voters who basically feel like they have their first candidate.
I agree.
Let me say something. I think, Matt, you would agree that this could get really racial if McCain thinks there's a chance that he could still win. He might bring Jeremiah Wright and other things, but if he feels like he might lose, he might take the Bob Dole path of having a more honorable campaign down the line.
I think that just like I believe that the Ayers thing was a huge mistake that they did. I think that if he does the Reverend Wright thing, that the American public is already on the path, and everything.
I'm not saying it'll work. I'm just saying.
I think if they choose that, they're choosing the least likely path for political.
He doesn't want to do it. He fought the Ayers thing also.
I think his first. I think.
All right, let's one and then two, and then we'll go back to.
Yeah, how do you see this? I mean, I don't agree with you at all. I've been reading the polls all along throughout the campaign, and the polls this summer do show clear racial divisions, particularly as to white voters and how they perceive things. This is why Palin, of course, was selected as a candidate. And I want to ask the panel what they think about what kind of coalition is going to emerge out of this. And this election isn't over, but is this the shattering of what the Republicans have based on their strategy for the past 30, 40 years, the whole Southern strategy, that is taking white working-class ethnics, pulling them out of the Democratic coalition, and will we not see something new emerge from this, different from what we see before?
Well, you addressed that to Matt, so Matt, why don't you?
Well, you know, I'd rather go one-on-one with him because, you know, I don't agree with it at all. I mean, you know, I could. We could
What part? I don't know what part you disagree.
well, you're saying there's no racial effect. That's complete baloney. I mean, there's obviously a racial effect in how the campaign is
Can I ask
factoring
a
itself
question?
into doing it.
Can I ask a question? So if you take a look at the data broken down by Democrat, Republican, and Independent right now, or over the course of the last 3 months, the reason why Barack Obama is ahead
Yeah.
is why? It's because
What just
there's
happened 4 weeks ago with the economy crashing the way it did? Coming out of the Republican convention, you could see that there was a clear advantage with the Republicans, and they could clearly.
You know what
clearly
changed to the Republican convention that quickly went away? Was the number of people that said, that identified themselves as a Republican went up after the convention. And when that effect wore off and we went back to where this equilibrium of this race is, which is Democrats with a 10 to 12 point advantage, which is where Barack Obama holds his lead, is the fact that he's a D in a year people want to vote for a Democrat. If Joe Biden was running for president, if Hillary Clinton were running for president, all of them would be up by somewhere between 4 and 8 points, 4 and 9 points in this election. What happened after the convention, people got enthusiastic and said, I'm going to take another look at John McCain and Sarah Palin, and isn't this an interesting iPod that they just put on the market, which is what she was. She was new. Nobody knew she was conservative. And when they put it on, it was like a woman, this, I've never seen this before, I'm going to take a second look. The generic numbers changed, the race tightened, then within a week or 8 days, the generic numbers moved back to where it was. Barack Obama takes a 4-point lead, and then all of a sudden the events, he wins the debate, Joe Biden wins the debate, Barack Obama wins the second debate, and the financial crisis happens all simultaneously, and Barack Obama goes from an equilibrium of a 4-point race to an equilibrium of a 6 or 7-point race. That's what's happened.
We'll go over here, please.
I wanted to ask Dr. Harris something before you leave.
Actually, Fred has to leave. If anyone has any specific questions, for Fred, the next
Is there
5
some
minutes.
sort of generational difference, like pre and post civil rights difference between, you know, your questions about identity and whether blacks should use political or economic means to get equality? Did you see any difference? Are the younger people more apt to say economic and I'm American?
Right. There were, just to provide more information, there were a series of questions in this survey that asked African Americans what were the best strategies for group progress. Should they think of themselves more as part of a group, a racial group, or should they see themselves more as individuals? So this is sort of classic American question. And in fact, black Americans were split in half. Interesting enough, when asked, should black people build more much more of economic power than political power, 3/4 said economic power than political power. So what we're seeing here is, I would add some sort of pragmatism that's developing within the black community. And also half were divided on whether should black people work within the political mainstream or mainstream political institutions, or should they be involved in protests as a way to make demands on the political system. But what we see is interesting. I didn't see much of a generational difference. And in fact, when it came to feeling a sense of being more American, older African Americans were more likely to say it than younger African Americans, which was a big surprise given that younger blacks were socialized within the post-civil rights era. So I think that there are just basically philosophical differences within the black community. Some of it's based more on class than generations. In fact, I think Matt Bai got part of the story wrong in that story about the end of black politics. It's not so much the end of black politics because of generational changes. I think what he looked at, talking about these new black leaders who de-emphasize race, or more likely to de-emphasize race when they think about policy, it has a lot to do with, I think, growing class differences within the black community. So these are Ivy League trained, elected officials who've done very well, from the mayor of Newark to the governor of Massachusetts. But in many ways, this de-racialized strategy has de-emphasized sort of those important issues that have been important to black constituencies, like justice, like racism in the criminal justice system, for instance, which hasn't been a part of discussions. And also other sort of important topics that involve these working class issues that you said, white voters weren't responding to. But initially, Barack Obama wasn't really talking about these issues among black voters. He talked more when he went before majority black audiences about personal responsibility. And here again, it's sort of these class differences, because there's been this internal, you talk about class, not really discussions about that. There are huge class discussions that have been going on for the past few years. Issues about, controversy about Bill Cosby, right, and about sort of comments he's made about poor blacks and not being responsible. So the personal responsibility questions are in many ways related to issues of class, even though, right, both working class, poor blacks, and middle class blacks vote Democrat. But if you look beneath that and look at some of these attitudinal questions about what's the best way for black people to make it in America, whether it's emphasis on the individualism or the progress of the group, whether they see themselves American first or see themselves as black first, these are debates that are being discussed within black communities among black leaders.
One of the interesting things, this may be, I hadn't thought of it this way, this may be the one example I can think of where Latinos set the standard for a new approach, rather than blacks setting the standard. Henry Cisneros is the first kind of that candidate. Then, before Obama does it in Chicago, you have Kenny Salazar doing it in Colorado, or simultaneously, where they're running without talking about ethnicity. And I described Ken as the new kind of Latino candidate. He doesn't have to talk about it. You touch Kenny and you know he's a Mexican. Kenny was my student. I know him very well. You touch him and you know you've touched a Mexican. But he's not going to tell you he's a Mexican. It's not an issue for him the way it was for some of the people earlier, where they had to bring it, because you wouldn't let him in the door otherwise.
Tom Bradley was like that as mayor of Los Angeles also. That's why he was a little stunning in that particular case. I agree with Matt. Yeah. It's much more complicated than those polling. So, but yeah, Tom Bradley actually was, really thought himself as a post-racial candidate, and a lot of people viewed him, particularly Democrats, obviously.
There have been many black Democrats who've done that over the years. I mean, even during the 80s, David Dinkins was ran as a racialized political candidate. Doug Wilder, who ran for governor of Virginia.
Wilder, maybe I would say.
Well, gorgeous mosaic.
We had 1, 2, and then we go to the right side of the room. Yes, sir.
The other day I saw issues-based poll results, and on every level of economy, immigration, the war, name it. Obama had leads of 20% or better, a few of 4 to 8 to 10%, but there wasn't one that McCain won, and he led dramatically on all of them. And then one would expect, when they then showed the national poll, as we know, the most up-to-date one, he led by, maybe 10 or 11%, which was closer to the ones issue, the level of issues that he barely won, 6 to 8%, as opposed to well into the 20s on many of them. And I was left with the very nagging feeling that race is a factor. Because if he looked more like JFK, in all due respect, than MLK, he'd be up by 40 points. And I'm not even getting into Sarah Palin, who will either in 3 weeks become a footnote to history or will be in our face for the next 4 to 16 years. I'll be 80 by then. Lots of luck, folks. But the bottom line is, explain to me how race is not a factor on every issue. It wasn't McCain won some, etc.
Well, if you take a look at the history of these presidential races in the last 30 years, and Republicans versus Democrats, on leads on issues, and what you have, which is why most people thought John Kerry was going to win, because when you take a look at the top 10 issues, he had leads on 7 or 8 of them, and some of them fairly substantial: healthcare, economy, major issues. He lost the election. Al Gore had leads on 7 of the top 10 issues. Jimmy Carter, 1980, had leads on 8 of the top 10 issues on election day. It is it's a myth that people decide these races based upon issues. It is a myth. Issues in voters' minds are indicators for something that they know about the candidate. So somebody could say, I trust or I approve of this candidate more on this issue than that one, but there's much more complicated factors going into person it is this person ready for office? I think the anchor on Barack Obama's leg has nothing to do with race, as it has to do with the fact that he is a youthful candidate, new on the scene, slightly a little bit doesn't connect well sometimes with average Americans. He speaks too well in many ways, in too long and too well, and so I think if you take one of the things that the Democratic Party has to overcome, it's interesting. They always underperform the generic ballot. Almost every single election, when you ask people who do you want to vote for president, the number that people say I want to vote for a Democrat, whether it's Dukakis, whether it's Clinton, whether it's whoever, Gore, whether it's Bradley, they underperform the generic ballot. And part of it, I think, is the perception of the country of what it is to be a Democrat running for president. And I think it's been tainted for a while by these people are just they don't fit where I am in my life. Whether it's cultural issues or many other number of issues, they're not like me. They're some, whatever, they're a northeastern liberal or whatever it happens to be. And I think that's what Barack Obama not only is I think there was some question. Hillary Clinton raised the question in the primaries, is he ready? Is he prepared? Can he lead? Which is what I thought the McCain campaign would have run their campaign on, but as soon as they picked Sarah Palin, they couldn't because it wasn't credible anymore. So they had to throw that out and come up with something else. But it is not unusual for Democrats to have these big leads on issues, but the American public being reluctant to vote for a Democrat, not because he's black. They had the same reluctance with John Kerry and Al Gore. And is this person like me in my life? Is this person, do they relate to what I care about? Which is why I think that statement that Barack Obama made about they cling, to their guns was hurtful at the time, very hurtful, because it basically said, oh no, here comes another Democrat that doesn't understand where I am in my life. I think that's a better explanation. But keep in mind that in this polarized country, if Barack Obama wins, let's say if he wins by 6 or 7 points, that is huge. That is huge. The last candidate to get a significant percentage, over 50% in this election.
Carter was...
The last Democrat.
Carter was at 50.
Yeah, a Democrat hasn't carried the white vote in this country since 1964. A Democrat has not carried the white vote in this country since 1964. And it's sort of the perception they have in the national parties. And so if he were to win by 6 or 7 points, that is huge.
Let me ask a follow-up question, and your answer won't affect the fact that I have to leave, so I don't think it's anything you said. My wife was a congressional aide for Tom Downey for many, many years. Internal polls always counted the most. I'm looking to get off Ambien, I'm just kidding about that, as quickly as I can. Hearing that if North Carolina's too late, too close to call, might ease me through that evening. My real question to you is, are you telegraphing, because you are connected better than anybody else in this room to what's really out there, are you telegraphing the internal polls, Matt? Are you trying to convey something to us that you know?
No, here's my judgment. It's the best indicator is don't look at the public polls. Look at how the campaigns are conducting themselves and how they're acting. And that will give you a clear indication of what's going on, where they're spending their time, what they're saying, and what's going on. And if you turned out all the polls and all the pundits and watched what Obama and how he's acting, and McCain and Sarah Palin how they're acting, and where they're campaigning, the fact that McCain and Palin are spending this much time in North Carolina, and it is a clear indication. It's not like, oh, let's run up our margin. It's a clear indication they have a problem. They didn't throw out William Ayers because they thought they were within 1 or 2 points. And the fact that John McCain stood up the other day and said, we're within 6. When you're a candidate that says we're only 6 points behind, you're at least 6 points behind when you're a candidate that says that. So I have great friends. Steve Schmidt, I did the 2004 race with Bush. I did the 2006 Arnold Schwarzenegger race with great friends there. I did races with David Axelrod for the last 20 years. When I did Democratic campaigns, I have good friends with both of them. Both of them are seeing the same data. And the same data, how the candidates conduct themselves, they're seeing the exact same thing.
Do you take much in
Oh,
fact
we have to
Michigan, by the way?
Yeah, I took that was a huge thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please. And then we're going to go right.
Could you give your opinion on Obama's impact on the Asian American vote?
Well, it's interesting. The Asian American vote, and that's something we didn't talk about, and interestingly enough here, it has been a very, very big swing group. and huge swings among Asian Americans in this country, at state level and national level. I think right now, the last data, good data I saw, Barack Obama was up 17, 18 points among Asian voters in this country. I think John Kerry split them or had a slight advantage on them. So, you know, they're swinging like a lot of swing groups in this country right now. But Asian Americans, I think it's a very, very, very interesting constituency that don't vote at all and overwhelmingly. They don't show up and say, I'm going to vote 80%, 70%, 60%. They swing in huge degrees, probably because that their social status is so diverse. The social status among Asian Americans is much more diverse than Latino voters and much more diverse than African American voters, and that's probably the explanation of why.
But don't you also find, I find it tiring that, for example, we would talk about the Asian vote. How many Asian voters are there? I mean, why would, if you're running a campaign, they're in California, largely. That's where the huge chunk is going to be. You have some in Minnesota, you have some in Houston. Why would you worry? I mean, campaigns, I just find that so fracturing of everything.
I think the reason why is it's the same reason why in certain percentages among Latino voters in some states is that when you build a campaign strategy, you premise on an election that you're going to win by one vote. You base your election on the fact that we have to put together a coalition and build a campaign, that we have to allocate the dollars in the most efficient way to get that. And you figure out what you can and can't get among white voters, you figure out what you can and can't get among black voters, you figure out what you can and can't get among Latinos, and you figure out what you can and can't get among Asians. And if there's an election, there is some states, and I think the Asian American population, I think they're voting, will vote about 3% of the national number. They will be 3% of all the votes cast will be Asian Americans in this country on election day. Where they're divided, they overwhelmingly, obviously, in California. In Oregon, there's a major chunk in Oregon. But if you take a look at places like Wisconsin, Iowa, Nevada, there's enough of a percentage in a dead even race, just like Latino voters, that it would matter. But that's just how you allocate your resources and how you talk to them.
Unfortunately, we have time for one more question or two quick ones. Sarah right here, and then one of the two in the back there, please.
The questions are quick, the answers aren't so quick.
I'm directing that to you.
I have a question for Matt Vidal. I'm thinking about the fact that the air thing didn't work. Like everyone agrees and the facts support it. Do you think that this will mean a change in future Republicans' campaigns when it comes to the tendency to lean on the sort of Lee Atwater tradition? Do you think that will change?
Well, here's my theory about delivery of negative information, or whatever the best people call it, contrast, or whatever it happens to be. It works if it's credible, and if it matters to the voter. So the delivery of information, it works if it's both of those things, credible and matters to the voter. The problem with the heirs thing is it came out of nowhere, and it's like, wait a sec. And oh, by the way, we're in the midst of a financial crisis. Why are we talking about a guy from 40 years ago that Barack Obama met in his living room or whatever it happens to be? It doesn't matter to the average American. And so hopefully it's going to tell campaigns that if you're going to talk about something, whether it's negative or positive, you're going to talk about something that's both credible and matters to the voter. In 1988, and I was actually working for Lloyd Benson, who was on the ticket for Dukakis, so... You're no Jack Kennedy. Yeah. The information that Bush raised in voters' minds was somebody culturally, was Mike Dukakis out of the cultural mainstream of America, and the presentation of whether it was death penalty or, faith or other things mattered to Americans. That person was out of sync with the presentation. The information was something people wanted to consider. The heirs thing, I think the Reverend Wright thing, if that happens to come up next, is people are right now sitting there, I can't find a job, and I'm trying to put my kids through school, and I can't afford a car, and all that. Why is Sarah Palin or John McCain talking about heirs who I don't even know who that is? That's the problem, I think, with that information. So hopefully it'll be a lesson to only talk about things that are credible and matter to the voters.
Unfortunately, I've been given the hook from the people who control the room, so that was an excellent discussion. Thanks for your participation.
Social status is so diverse. The social status among Asian Americans is much more diverse than Latino voters, and much more diverse than African American voters, and that's probably the explanation of why.
But don't you also find, I find it tiring that, for example, we would talk about the Asian vote. How many Asian voters are there? I mean, why would, if you're running a campaign, they're in California, largely. That's where the huge chunk is going to be. You have some in Minnesota, you have some in Houston. Why would you worry? I mean, campaigns, I just find that so fracturing of everything.
I think the reason why is it's the same reason why in certain percentages among Latino voters in some states is that when you build a campaign strategy, you premise it on an election that you're going to win by one vote. You base your election on the fact that we have to put together a coalition and build a campaign, that we have to allocate the dollars in the most efficient way to get that. And you figure out what you can and can't get among white voters, you figure out what you can and can't get among black voters, you figure out what you can and can't get among Latinos, and you figure out what you can and can't get among Asians. And if there's an election, there is some states, and I think the Asian American population, I think they're voting, will vote about 3% of the national number. They will be 3% of all the votes cast will be Asian Americans in this country on election day. Where they're divided, they overwhelmingly obviously in California. In Oregon, there's a major chunk in Oregon. But if you take a look at places like Wisconsin, Iowa, Nevada, there's enough of a percentage in a dead even race, just like Latino voters, that it would matter. But that's just how you allocate your resources and how you talk to them.
Unfortunately, we have time for one more question or two quick ones. Sarah right here, and then one of the two in the back there, please.
The questions are quick, the answers aren't so quick.
I was directing that to you.
I have a question for Matthew Dowd. I'm thinking about the fact that the air thing didn't work. Like everyone agrees and the facts support it. Do you think that this will mean a change in future Republicans' campaigns when it comes to the tendency to lean on the sort of Lee Atwater tradition? Do you think that will change?
Well, here's my theory about delivery of negative information, or whatever the best people call it, contrast, whatever it happens to be. It works if it's credible, and if it matters to the voter. So the delivery of information, it works if it's both of those things, credible and matters to the voter. The problem with the heirs thing is it came out of nowhere, and it's like, wait a sec. And oh, by the way, we're in the midst of a financial crisis. Why are we talking about a guy from 40 years ago that Barack Obama met in his living room or whatever it happens to be? It doesn't matter to the average American. And so hopefully it's going to tell campaigns that if you're going to talk about something, whether it's negative or positive, you're going to talk about something that's both credible and matters to the voter. In 1988, and I was actually working for Lloyd Bentsen, who was on the ticket for Dukakis, so...
You're no Jack Kennedy.
Yeah. The information that Bush raised in voters' minds was somebody culturally, was Mike Dukakis out of the cultural mainstream of America, and the presentation of whether it was death penalty or, faith or other things mattered to Americans. That person was out of sync with the presentation. The information was something people wanted to consider. The heirs thing, I think the Reverend Wright thing, if that happens to come up next, is people are right now sitting there, I can't find a job, I'm trying to put my kids through school, and I can't afford a car, and all that. Why is Sarah Palin or John McCain talking about heirs who I don't even know who that is? That's the problem, I think, with that information. So hopefully it'll be a lesson to only talk about things that are credible and matter to the voters.
Unfortunately, I've been given the hook from the people who control the room, so that was an excellent discussion. Thanks for your participation.